Imagine you're at a quiet dinner party. The conversation is light, the wine is flowing, and everything feels perfectly stable. Then someone casually mentions a minor mistake you made at work. To everyone else, it's a fleeting comment, a footnote in the night. But for you, the room suddenly starts to warp. The air feels heavy, your stomach drops, and the panic isn't just rising, it's flooding your entire reality. To the people sitting across from you, you've just had an incomprehensible outburst. They see a scene, they see someone who is too much. But in that moment, you aren't trying to be difficult or dramatic. You're simply trying to survive a hurricane that no one else in the room can even feel. Strange, isolating contradiction. Wanting nothing more than to be understood, while fearing that the moment you truly let someone in, they'll decide you're impossible to love. And that exact contradiction is exactly what we are plunging straight into for this deep dive.
Yeah, because that internal hurricane you're describing, that massive invisible storm, is probably one of the most fundamentally misunderstood experiences in all of human psychology.
Oh, absolutely.
Because, I mean, if we are the ones sitting across the table at that dinner party, it is so incredibly easy to view their reaction as a sign of, like, fundamental brokenness.
Right. You just see a total overreaction.
Exactly. We see this minor comment trigger a huge explosion, and the outside world immediately labels it as irrational or manipulative or just broken. But it isn't brokenness at all.
No.
What we're actually looking at is a profoundly sensitive nervous system that is responding to a perceived threat of rejection. It's a biological system working exactly as it was wired to work. It detects a threat to its survival, and it just sounds the alarm.
Yeah, and that exact dynamic where, a seemingly minor comment or a slight shift in tone or just a brief moment of distance triggers this absolute existential panic that sets the perfect stage for the fear of abandonment to become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It's like clockwork.
And we really need to unpack the anatomy of that self-fulfilling prophecy today, because this dynamic, it doesn't just happen in the abstract space of clinical psychology textbooks. It happens in these mundane, quiet moments of life, like on a random Tuesday night.
It's always the everyday stuff.
Yeah. So I want to ground this by looking at a really specific narrative, a story about something as simple as like a milk run.
Okay.
Yes, you have a couple in an apartment. Let's call the partner David. And David realizes they're out of milk, so he tells his partner, hey, I'm just going to run down to the corner store. He says he'll be back in 5 minutes.
Normal, everyday interaction.
Exactly. So he grabs his coat, walks out the door, and pulls it shut. But I want you to listen to the sensory reality of this moment. There's that sharp final click of the deadbolt sliding into place.
Wow. Yeah.
And in a quiet apartment, for a nervous system that is wired for abandonment, that click echoes like a gunshot.
Because it's a definitive acoustic signal of separation.
Yes. David is just going for milk. But the silence that's left behind in that apartment, it doesn't feel like a brief 5-minute errand. To the person left inside, that silence physically settles over the room like an eviction notice.
It feels permanent.
Completely permanent. The physical trembling starts almost immediately. The heart rate spikes. The hands are literally shaking while picking up the phone to dial his number.
The alarm bells are ringing.
Right. So the phone rings once, twice. And by the 5th unanswered call, there's this suffocating terror that actually claws at the throat. It's a literal physiological constriction.
Yeah, because the body thinks it's dying.
And then the internal whisper starts. And it's not just a passing worry, it is this entirely convincing, absolute certainty. He is not coming back. He finally realized, I am too much. He is gone. And the behavioral reaction to that thought is entirely visceral. It's this frantic, chaotic race through the bedroom. It's pulling a suitcase down from the top of the closet, just throwing clothes into it haphazardly, weeping openly onto the fabric.
You're just trying to do something, anything to take control.
Actually, it's picking up the phone again and drafting these venomous, cruel text messages. Messages that are meant to push him away first, It's a desperate, messy attempt to preempt the unbearable pain of his departure by initiating the destruction yourself.
Right. The classic, I'll leave you before you can leave me.
Yeah. And then comes the excruciating anticlimax.
Boy.
The deadbolt turns again, the door unlocks, David walks in. It's been exactly 10 minutes, and he is holding a carton of skim milk.
He has no idea what just happened in that room.
None. He walks into the hallway, completely oblivious, and finds his partner standing by the front door with a packed suitcase, screaming hysterically about leaving him.
Ow.
And there is David standing there completely bewildered in his winter coat. The cold condensation from the plastic milk carton is just dripping slowly, drop by drop, onto the hardwood floorboards.
Image.
And in that exact fraction of a second, you can actually see the exhaustion finally break David's resolve. His shoulders physically drop.
Yeah, you can only take so much of that.
Right. The look in his eyes shifts from this momentary confusion to just a deep, hollow fatigue. And for the partner who's holding the handle of the suitcase, there is this bitter, metallic taste of ash in the mouth. It's the sudden, horrifying realization that fighting so violently against being left behind has resulted in building the exact wall that David is now going to walk out of.
Yeah, and that entire sequence is the self-fulfilling prophecy functioning with just tragic mechanical precision.
It really is mechanical, isn't it?
I mean, if we pull back and deconstruct what's actually happening in that hallway, it's not just some random outburst. It follows a very distinct psychological architecture.
Right, there's a structure to the madness.
Exactly. The entire sequence begins with a deeply ingrained, almost cellular belief structure. The brain says, everybody's going to abandon me. It is only a matter of when.
It's treated as a fact.
Yes. That is the foundational premise the brain is operating under. And because that belief is held as a fundamental law of physics, the individual inevitably treats the partner as though they are inherently untrustworthy.
Like they already have one foot out the door.
They treat them as though they are perpetually on the verge of walking out. The sheer weight of that constant expectation and the frantic, exhausting behaviors it produces, the interrogations, the packed bags, the relentless need for reassurance, it ultimately just drains the life out of the connection.
It's exhausting for the partner.
It exhausts the partner until the partner, who initially had absolutely no intention of leaving, is forced to walk away just for their own emotional survival.
And then the cycle completes itself.
Exactly. When they do finally leave, it flawlessly reinforces the original devastating belief. The brain says, see, I knew it. They always leave.
It is perfectly closed loop, but I want to break down how we get from a missing person to a packed bag, because there's actually a specific framework for understanding how that loop operates stage by stage, right?
Yes. If we look at the rejection sensitivity model, it provides a very clear 6-stage framework for how this hurricane forms. It really explains the mechanics of the escalation.
Yes.
So stage 1 is the baseline vulnerability. The panic isn't just happening in a vacuum. It is created by prior historical experiences of severe rejection or invalidation. That trauma permanently primes the nervous system. So the individual is walking around with a baseline vulnerability that is just much, much higher than average.
Right. They're already on edge before David even mentions the milk.
Exactly. Stage 2 is the situational trigger. In the story we're looking at, the trigger is the unanswered phone calls while David is at the store. Now, objectively, it's ambiguous. He could be talking to the cashier, he could have his phone on silent, but it is a stimulus.
Right, and this is where the divergence happens, because stage 3 is where that trigger sparks anxious expectations. The brain doesn't just say, oh, he's busy. The brain immediately jumps to the absolute worst case scenario.
Exactly. And that leads directly into stage 4, which is the warping of perception.
Well, warping of perception.
Yeah, this is a fascinating cognitive phenomenon. Because the anxious expectation is so incredibly high, the actual perception of the external event becomes completely distorted. The individual is no longer interacting with reality, they're interacting entirely with their fear.
Oh.
To them, he is not delayed at the checkout counter. In their mind, he is actively, maliciously leaving them. The ambiguity is completely erased and replaced with this absolute certainty of threat.
Which then sets off stage 5, and this is where I really want to pause, because stage 5 is the intense cognitive affective reaction. And this isn't just a bad mood. We're talking about physiological panic here, right? Like, what is actually happening in the body when they're staring at the phone after that 5th missed call?
Well, we are looking at a full-scale hijacking of the nervous system. The brain's threat detection center, primarily the amygdala, registers the unanswered phone call not as a social disappointment, but as a literal threat to biological survival.
Because biologically, isolation is dangerous.
Exactly. From an evolutionary standpoint, for a vulnerable mammal, isolation equals death. So the amygdala sounds the alarm, and it just floods the body with stress hormones, cortisol, and adrenaline.
Ah.
The heart rate accelerates to pump blood to the limbs for fight or flight.
Getting ready to run.
Right. And the vagus nerve, which normally helps regulate a state of calm and social engagement, essentially shuts down. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for logic, reason, and time perception, goes offline.
So they literally can't think straight.
Oh, they can't. This is why they can't think rationally and say, hey, it's only been 10 minutes. The biological system is screaming that they are under active attack. That is the cognitive affective reaction.
And because they're in a state of biological survival, we get stage 6, the behavioral reaction, because you can't just sit quietly on the couch reading magazine when your body thinks it is dying.
No, you have to act.
So you pack the bag, you scream at the door, you send the venomous text, you do something, anything, to exert control over this terrifying situation. And those very behaviors are what inevitably damage the relationship, leading right back to stage 1. The cycle is complete.
It's tragic, but it's incredibly predictable when you understand the biology.
But wait, I want to push back on this underlying premise for a second. If we look at the baseline vulnerability, the fear of abandonment, we have to introduce a reality check here.
Okay.
Because if we look at the human condition, abandonment is biologically baked into it. It's completely unavoidable. Securely attached people, people who do not have this intense rejection sensitivity and who don't pack bags over milk runs, they also know that relationships end. They know about brutal breakups. They know about death. The fundamental truth of existence is that everyone we love will eventually leave us, one way or another. So my question is, if the reality of loss is universal, why does the secure person manage to actually enjoy the relationship and thrive in it, while the insecure person is completely paralyzed by the exact same reality?
It's a really profound question. And the difference does not lie in the objective reality they inhabit. Like you said, they are both mortal. They both face loss.
Right.
The pivotal distinction lies entirely in the element of presence and how they relate to the concept of time.
So,
Well, secure individuals operate with a baseline acceptance of the inevitability of eventual loss. They know on some level that it will happen, but paradoxically, accepting that reality breeds a deep, grounding presence and gratitude while the connection actually lasts.
so the fragility almost makes it more valuable.
If you know a connection is finite, it doesn't have to be terrifying. It can become something to fiercely treasure in the current moment. The grief is reserved for the actual event of the loss.
When it actually happens.
Right. But this severe fear of abandonment operates entirely differently. It forces the individual to live completely in a projected future of loss. The fear is so loud, the anticipation of the pain is so all-consuming that it literally robs them of the present connection.
Oh, see.
They can't enjoy the dinner party because they are already living in the argument on the ride home. They can't enjoy the quiet, safe evening in the apartment because they are waiting for the lock to click and the partner to never return.
Dating.
It initiates the self-fulfilling prophecy because the partner is essentially in a relationship with someone who is not mentally or emotionally in the room with them. The individual is living in a future where the relationship has already failed.
It's like living in the wreckage of a storm that hasn't even made landfall yet. You're bracing for the hurricane while the sun is still shining. So if we shift and look at the architecture of this void, we really have to ask where this hurricane actually originates. Because a reaction of that magnitude, packing a suitcase and hyperventilating over unanswered phone calls, is rarely the fault of, like, a bad high school breakup.
No, definitely not.
A single bad relationship in your 20s doesn't rewire your nervous system to hallucinate abandonment. The roots have to trace back much further, usually to childhood. It traces back to a time when an individual needed safe containment, when they needed a literal and emotional anchor, but simply did not receive it.
And to understand that, we have to look deeply at developmental arrest and this concept of self-abandonment. Because when a child is abandoned, a critical gap forms.
And we should clarify what we mean by abandonment here.
Yes, this is vital to understand. Abandonment does not just mean physical absence. We're just talking about a parent who left in the middle of the night.
Right.
Abandonment can mean a caregiver who is physically present in the living room every single day, but who is emotionally immature, deeply dismissive, or entirely dysregulated themselves.
So they are there, but they aren't there.
And when that happens, the child is cut off from crucial mentorship. Human beings are not born knowing how to regulate massive emotions. We aren't born knowing how to conceptualize our own autonomous identity or how to soothe ourselves when we are terrified.
We have to learn that.
We learn those deeply complex psychological skills through the scaffolding provided by a safe, attuned adult. The adult co-regulates the child until the child can self-regulate.
That makes total sense.
But if a child is not guided through their emotional or autonomous development is arrested in that specific area. The child adapts by suppressing their needs to maintain whatever fragile connection they have with the caregiver.
They just do whatever it takes to keep the parent around.
Right. And when that child becomes an adult, this early deficit manifests as self-abandonment. Because they were never taught how to hold space for their own fear, their own anger, or their own sadness without being punished or ignored, they naturally neglect the parts of themselves that were never nurtured. They have a massive void where internal regulation and self-intimacy should be.
That brings up an analogy that I think is really crucial for understanding how this actually feels to the individual. Think of a secure adult, someone who received that early scaffolding and co-regulation as a fully furnished house.
I like this analogy.
It has a solid concrete foundation, it has walls, it has a roof, it has furniture. If a guest comes into that house and eventually leaves, the house is empty of that person. The guest is gone. But the structure itself remains completely intact. The house is still a house.
Right.
But for someone with early developmental wounds, someone who has experienced that profound self-abandonment you just described, the partner is not a guest walking into a furnished room. The partner is a load-bearing wall.
It is a load-bearing wall, yes. But we actually have to take that analogy even further. It is not just holding up the roof. For someone who lacks self-intimacy, that partner is holding the foundation itself together. Without that wall, the house doesn't just sag, it shatters.
It completely collapses.
Exactly. When an adult with a secure sense of self, the fully furnished house experiences a breakup or a separation, they lose the partner's company. It is undeniably painful. They grieve the loss of companionship, the shared memories, the physical warmth, but they retain their internal wholeness. They were still a complete, intact entity facing a loss.
They know they will survive it.
But when an individual who has self-abandon experiences a breakup, or even just a perceived separation like David taking 10 minutes at the grocery store, they do not feel they are losing company. They feel they are losing their actual wholeness.
Because the partner was the structure?
Because the partner was serving as that load-bearing wall, yes. The partner was externally regulating all the parts of themselves they could not handle. So the partner's departure returns them to a state of absolute, terrifying fragmentation. They feel like they cease to exist as a whole person. The house is literally collapsing in on them, crushing them.
And when you feel like your house is collapsing, when you feel like you are being crushed out of existence, the behavioral fallout is going to be massive. And this really explains why the crime simply does not fit the punishment in these situations. Because the emotional self feels as though its literal wholeness is being stolen, the individual punishes the departing partner with an immense, blinding ferocity.
Because they're fighting for their lives.
Exactly. The partner who maybe merely withdrew their company for an evening or needed some space after an argument or was just delayed in traffic faces a reaction suited for someone committing a psychological murder.
Right.
They are being screamed at, insulted, and pushed away with a level of aggression that make absolutely no sense to them. From their perspective, they just went to get milk. But from the individual's perspective, they were fighting for their life. This disproportionate punishment causes massive confusion and deep resentment in the partner, which rapidly accelerates the relationship's demise.
And we can actually trace this exact behavioral dynamic, this life or death reaction to separation, back to the foundational research in developmental psychology. If we look at Mary Ainsworth's famous strange situation experiment, it physically grounds everything we're discussing about the nervous system and attachment.
Right, this is the classic study from the 1970s. Let's break down exactly how this experiment worked because the details are fascinating.
The procedure was meticulously designed to observe attachment in infancy, specifically how a child balances the need to explore with the need for safety.
How did they set it up?
So a child, usually around a year old, and their parent are placed in an unfamiliar room with some toys. A stranger enters the room and sits quietly. Then the parent gets up and leaves the room, leaving the child alone with the stranger.
Which is stressful for a baby.
After a few minutes, the parent returns. The critical data doesn't just come from how the child plays. It comes from how the child reacts to the departure and the eventual reunion.
And the researchers observed 3 distinct patterns which align perfectly with what we see in adult relationships today.
First, you had children who had developed an avoidant attachment style. When the parent left, they seemingly ignored the departure. They kept playing with the toys. They ignored the stranger. When the parent returned, they didn't seek comfort.
They just acted like nothing happened.
Outwardly, they looked completely fine, almost fiercely independent. But here's a critical part. When researchers used physiological monitoring on these seemingly calm children, their internal distress levels, their heart rates, their cortisol levels were incredibly high.
So they were freaking out internally.
They were terrified. But they had already learned that expressing distress to their caregiver yielded no results, or maybe even brought punishment, so they suppressed the behavioral display of it.
Group.
Then you had children with an anxious attachment style. These children became intensely, inconsolably distraught the absolute second the parent left the room. They couldn't play. They couldn't focus. And the tragedy is, even when the parent returned, they could not be calmed down.
So the reunion didn't even fix it.
No. They would cling to the parent, but also hit them or push them away. They remained in a state of high alarm, punishing the parent for leaving.
That is exactly the adult with the suitcase at the door, clinging to the relationship while screaming at the partner.
Yes, it's the exact same mechanism. And finally, you have the secure children. This is the model for the fully furnished house. When the parent left, the secure children would cry. They felt the pain of the separation. They were not robots. They missed their caregiver.
Right.
But after a period of distress, they would adjust. They would eventually calm down, turn to the stranger, and begin to play again. And when the parent returned, they would seek comfort, receive it, and settle quickly.
Because they knew on a foundational level that the parent was coming back.
The secure child recovers because they possess what psychology calls an internal working model of the world as a fundamentally safe place.
An internal working model.
Yeah. Through repeated experiences of having their needs met, they've internalized the belief that their distress will be answered. They know that even if the primary caregiver is temporarily absent, they are not annihilated. They have the internal resources built through mentorship to tolerate the gap.
But the individual standing by the door with the suitcase screaming at David, they do not have that internal working model.
No, they were never given it.
For them, the gap doesn't feel temporary. The gap feels lethal.
Exactly.
So we are looking at this profound life-altering pain, this sense of impending psychological collapse where the nervous system is screaming that you are about to die. And we really have to ask, how does society, and even a lot of traditional cognitive therapies, usually tell people to treat this kind of intense emotional hurricane?
Usually by telling them to stop feeling it.
Right. The cultural mandate is almost entirely focused on the concept of regulation everywhere. The standard advice is to regulate your emotions, control your anxiety, suppress those massive, messy feelings so you can be appropriate.
Use your coping skills.
Yeah, use your coping skills so you can function at the dinner party and not make a scene.
And that cultural mandate to suppress and control is deeply historically ingrained. We view negative emotions as a malfunction to be fixed. But there is a substantial growing body of empirical evidence arguing that attempting to forcefully regulate these massive emotions is often the very cause of the continued pathology.
Really?
Yeah. The mandate to control is actually feeding the hurricane. This brings us to a concept known as experiential avoidance.
Experiential avoidance.
Right. It's the fundamental unwillingness to remain in contact with painful bodily sensations, emotions, memories, or thoughts, coupled with active steps to alter the form or frequency of those events. The culture tells us that feeling terror or deep abandonment pain is bad, so we must avoid it at all costs. But the avoidance itself becomes the trap.
I want to push back on experiential avoidance for a second.
Sure.
Because if I am having a massive panic attack at work, or if I feel this abandonment terror rising up while I'm at the grocery store, society tells me to regulate because I have to. I have a job to do. I can't just drop to the floor and weep in aisle 4. Are you saying that regulation itself is entirely bad?
No.
Yeah.
True emotional regulation, which involves recognizing an emotion, validating it, and choosing a response aligned with your values, is healthy.
Okay.
What we're talking about here is suppression masquerading as regulation. It is the desperate, white-knuckled attempt to stop feeling the feeling. When you spend all your psychological energy trying to force an emotion out of existence, you aren't regulating. You are at war with your own nervous system.
Which makes me think of the cereal sevens metaphor, which perfectly captures how exhausting this war really is. Let's make this tangible for a second.
Yeah.
Imagine I ask you to sit down and think through a highly complex, deeply personal problem in your life. Maybe you're trying to figure out if you should change careers. But while you are trying to solve this life problem, I force you to simultaneously subtract serial sevens in your head.
Possible.
Start at 1,000, subtract 7, subtract 7, subtract 7 over and over out loud while trying to plan your career. Obviously, you can't do it. Your brain cannot hold both.
Right.
You can't focus on the life problem. You feel overwhelmed, you feel guilty, and you feel full of failure because you can't figure out your life. So you seek out a professional. You go to a therapist to help you regulate your sevens. You want better cognitive control over the math. Society tells you that you need better focus.
But that's the wrong problem.
Exactly, because the real structural question we should be asking is, Who said subtracting sevens was the problem you needed to solve in the first place? Who told you that the presence of the math, or in our case, the presence of the painful emotion, was the enemy you had to defeat before you could live your life?
That metaphor perfectly encapsulates the futility of experiential avoidance. You are spending all your cognitive and emotional energy fighting the presence of the feeling, subtracting the sevens, rather than actually living your life or solving the underlying issue.
It's just a massive drain of resources.
And there is stark empirical evidence on the rebound effect of thought suppression. If you instruct subjects in a laboratory setting to explicitly suppress a thought, the classic "do not think of a white bear" experiment, they will inevitably think of the white bear more frequently than a control group.
Right, because you have to think about it to remember not to think about it.
Exactly. But it goes beyond just thoughts. It applies to physical pain as well.
Really?
Yeah. In studies where subjects are exposed to a painful physical stimulus, if you ask them to actively suppress the feeling of pain, they actually rate the pain as significantly more unpleasant than subjects who are told to just notice the pain. Furthermore, the disappearance of the pain following the withdrawal of the stimulus is significantly slower for the suppression group.
So fighting the pain actually makes it hurt worse and makes it last longer.
Experiential avoidance amplifies distress. When an individual views the mere detection of a negative emotion, like the rising panic of abandonment, when the lock clicks as a signal to withdraw or a mandate to control it, they become trapped.
It's a cage.
The culture's demand to control the emotion traps them in a cycle where the emotion dictates all behavior. Why did they pack the suitcase? Because they were trying to control and avoid the unbearable emotion of waiting to be left. All their behavior is organized around avoiding the feeling.
So if control is the enemy and suppression makes the hurricane stronger, what is the alternative? How do we actually respond to a nervous system that is melting down? Let's look at the sensory reality of room 204. I want to set the scene vividly because it contrasts so sharply with the clinical mandate to control. Picture room 204. You know the exact kind of institutional room I mean. The fluorescent lights overhead are humming with this sterile, buzzing indifference. The linoleum floor is freezing. And you've got Elena backed entirely into a corner of the room. There is a shattered plastic water cup at her feet, water pooling slowly around her shoes. She is taking jagged, shallow breaths, her shoulders heaving. She is completely biologically dysregulated.
Total amygdala hijack.
Yes. And standing a few feet away is Dr. Eris. He is holding a clipboard. He is doing everything by the book. His voice is this droning metronome of cognitive behavioral platitudes. He is commanding her to identify the cognitive distortion.
Oh, yeah.
He is holding his hands up in a textbook, open-palmed gesture of pacification, trying to de-escalate the situation with pure logic and reason. And Elena flinches. Every time he speaks, she curls tighter into a defensive ball, looking exactly like a wounded animal bracing for a physical strike.
Because that's how it feels to her.
Right. The institutional protocols in that room, the doctor's entire approach, are designed entirely to manage and contain the behavior. But stepping past that, doctor, if you know what you are looking at, you don't see a behavioral issue to be controlled. You see the ghost of a neglected child wearing a 30-year-old's body. So you bypass the doctor. You don't bring a clipboard. You sit directly on the cold linoleum floor 5 feet away from her. You don't demand that she breathe. You don't demand that she calm down or identify her distortions. You completely mirror her posture. You sit in the mess with her, and you just whisper, "I am not going anywhere."
Yeah.
And for 20 minutes, the only sound in room 204 is the ticking clock on the wall and the hum of the lights. No demands, no logic. And slowly, without a single cognitive demand being placed on her, the jagged breathing softens. The frantic shaking subsides.
And that encounter is the absolute perfect illustration of why the clinical control-based approach failed and the relational validating approach succeeded. We have to remember what is happening physiologically to Elena in that corner.
Her nervous system is on fire.
As we discussed with stage 5, her nervous system is completely hijacked by the fear of abandonment and the historical pain of invalidation. The prefrontal cortex is offline.
So the logic part of her brain is just inaccessible?
Completely. When a nervous system is in that state of acute hyperarousal, logic, cognitive restructuring, and demands to identify the distortion, do not feel like help. They feel like a continuation of the original abuse.
That makes total sense.
They feel exactly like a childhood caregiver looking at a terrified child and saying, "Your reality is wrong, you are being irrational."
So the doctor is actually re-traumatizing her in that moment.
Yes, Dr. Aris, despite his training, was demanding that Elena control her storm so that he could be comfortable, so that the room could be orderly. The alternative approach, sitting on the floor, was simply sitting in the ruins of her reality with her.
It's just bearing witness.
This is a core psychological truth. When emotional pain cries out for connection, offering logic is equivalent to offering a drowning person a lecture on fluid dynamics. It is useless, and it is alienating. Emotional pain of this magnitude cries out for profound connection, safety, and validation, not clinical control.
And this really recontextualizes how we view heavily stigmatized diagnoses like borderline personality disorder, doesn't it? Because the behaviors associated with BPD, the frantic efforts to avoid abandonment, the intense anger, the sudden shifts, they look manipulative to the outside world. But this strips away the stigma entirely.
It dismantles the stigma completely. When we look at BPD or severe rejection sensitivity through the lens of a hijacked nervous system and early developmental arrest, it's not about manipulation.
They aren't trying to be difficult.
It is not about someone being inherently difficult or toxic or maliciously trying to ruin a dinner party. It is a nervous system that has been perfectly adaptively wired to detect threats of rejection. And that wiring was usually forged in early environments where feelings were constantly dismissed, punished, or ignored.
So they learn to survive.
They adapted to survive a hostile environment, and now that adaptation is destroying their adult life. Healing from that kind of profound systemic wiring cannot be achieved just by attempting to outthink the pain or outlogic the panic on a whiteboard.
You can't just talk yourself out of it.
No. It requires therapies that are rooted in somatic awareness, actually feeling the body in distress tolerance, and in building actual earned trust. The nervous system has to learn, through repeated safe experiences like someone sitting on the floor with them, that the world is safe.
But here's the massive practical challenge. It is beautiful when someone sits on the linoleum with you.
Yes.
But how does an individual sit with their own pain when there isn't anyone else in the room, when it is 3 a.m. and the panic is rising in your throat and your partner is asleep or gone and there is no one there to whisper, "I am not going anywhere"? How do you break the literal meaning of that terror on your own? Because stripping a word of its power intellectually doesn't stop my hands from shaking.
That is the exact hurdle. And that is where the concept of cognitive diffusion comes in.
Cognitive diffusion.
Cognitive diffusion is a core technique in acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. And the primary goal of diffusion is radical. The goal is not to feel good. The goal is not to force the anxiety to disappear. The goal is to feel everything fully, to allow the anxiety to exist and still live effectively. It is, but it breaks the illusion that our thoughts are absolute, literal truths. Let's look at the clinical exercise, often called the milk exercise. It demonstrates a phenomenon called semantic satiation.
Let's do it right now. If you are listening to this wherever you are, just think about the word milk for a second. When you first hear it, your brain instantly connects the sound to the concept. You can almost taste it. You can picture the white liquid. You can feel the cold glass. You think of cereal or coffee. The word has a profound, literal semantic function. It means something real.
Exactly. The sound is fused to the meaning. But then in therapy, you ask the client to repeat the word milk out loud, rapidly, over and over again for 60 seconds. Milk, 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 milk.
Yeah.
If you do this, by the end of that minute, the word completely loses its semantic function. The brain fatigues from the repetition. It is no longer a cold beverage in your mind. It becomes just a strange, arbitrary audio stimulus. You realize it is just shapes made by the mouth and vibrations of the vocal cords.
It totally strips the power and the meaning from the word. But wait, how does saying milk help someone at 3 a.m. who is terrified their partner is leaving them?
Because you apply the exact same mechanical principle to the terrifying thoughts. This was used to profound effect with a client we'll call Mark, who suffered from intense, paralyzing relationship anxiety.
Okay, how did it work for him?
Well, Mark was constantly plagued by the recurring thought, "I'm worthless." And when that thought arose, it didn't feel like a passing neural firing. It felt like a mandate. It felt like absolute truth, and it drove him to push his partners away.
It felt like a fact.
Exactly. So Mark and his therapist sat in a room, and instead of trying to argue with the thought, instead of Dr. Ayers trying to prove that Mark is worthy, they used diffusion. They repeated that devastating phrase, "I'm worthless," dozens and dozens of times, over and over, rapidly out loud. "I'm worthless, I'm worthless, I'm worthless." Just like the milk, it temporarily lost its literal meaning. The syllables uncoupled from the trauma. It revealed to Mark experientially that thoughts are not truth with a capital T. They're just arbitrary sounds. They're just mind stuff. They're echoes of history firing in the brain, but they are not dictates for how he must act in the present.
That shift from believing a thought is a literal truth that must be acted upon to realizing it is just mind stuff passing through the brain is massive.
It's life-changing.
But I want to go back to the physical body, because recognizing that a thought is just a sound is one thing. Dealing with the physiological hangover of the nervous system is another.
Yes, the body keeps the score.
Right. This brings us to a final, incredibly visceral narrative. Think about the morning aftermath. It is the morning after one of these intense emotional episodes. It is the morning after the dinner party outburst or the morning after the suitcase at the door.
The storm has passed.
Yes, but the physical hangover is absolute. The throat is raw from screaming or crying, the eyes are swollen into heavy, painful slits, and the shame is not just a cognitive thought, it is a physical weight pressing against the ribs, making it genuinely hard to take a deep breath.
The shame is so heavy.
The societal labels are hovering in the air of the bedroom: manipulative, toxic, broken, borderline. The dominant feeling is a bone-deep, profound exhaustion.
So what do you do in that moment?
Well, the instruction from somatic therapy in this moment is to drop into the body. You intentionally bypass the chaotic, punishing mental narratives. You stop trying to figure out who was right or wrong last night. You just feel the physical sensation in the present moment.
Just getting out of your head.
Exactly. And in dropping in, the realization hits. The hands are clenched. They're clenched so tightly the knuckles are white. It is a physical manifestation of decades spent bracing for a blow from childhood that is still echoing in the muscles 30 years later.
Wow. Still holding on to that tension.
Yeah. Deliberately and with an immense amount of painful effort, the fingers are forced to uncurl. One by one, the ambient air of the room finally touches the palms.
It's a tiny movement, but so significant.
It is a minuscule victory. Nobody else in the world can see it. But as the tension seeps out of the fingertips and down into the faded rug, the monstrous heavy label of the diagnosis shrinks. In that specific moment, the individual is not a walking tragedy that needs to be fixed or regulated or managed by a doctor. They were simply a tired human being learning how to open their hands.
Opening the hands in that moment is far more than just a physical release. It is an act of profound self-compassion. And self-compassion is the ultimate, final anchor in breaking this entire self-fulfilling prophecy.
Because it changes how you treat yourself.
Yes. It represents a monumental shift away from the harsh self-judgment and the isolating feeling of abnormality, and a shift toward common humanity and mindfulness. When an individual can sit in the wreckage of their own emotional storm, when they can look at the packed suitcase in the hallway or the shattered plastic cup in room 204 and treat themselves with warmth and care rather than harsh, punitive criticism, a fundamental rewiring of the brain begins.
They are essentially doing for themselves what a parent should have done.
Exactly. They are actively reparenting themselves. In that moment of unclenching their hands, they are finally providing the safe containment and the validation that they were denied in childhood. By refusing to judge the storm, by refusing to hate themselves for the panic, they build the internal resource that proves they will not abandon themselves. It is the absolute crux of it. Building the internal certainty, the unbreakable foundation, that you will not abandon yourself, regardless of who else leaves the room.
It changes the entire foundation of the house. We've traced an incredible arc here, shifting our entire perspective on what these intense reactions actually mean. We've seen that the hurricane-like reactions to minor slights, the packed suitcases over an unanswered phone call, they are not signs of a broken character or a malicious personality. They are the loud, desperate echoes of early unmet needs.
Perfect.
And we've seen that the path forward isn't found in the cultural mandate to forcefully suppress or tightly control those emotions. It isn't found in subtracting serial sevens. The path is found by moving toward pure connection, whether that is someone sitting on the cold linoleum with you, or using cognitive diffusion to strip the terror from your own thoughts at 3 a.m., or employing deep physical self-compassion to finally open your clenched hands the morning after. That is how the cycle of the self-fulfilling prophecy is finally broken.
The true tragedy of the self-fulfilling prophecy is never just that the feared abandonment comes to pass. The deeper tragedy is that the relentless, exhausting effort to prevent people from leaving ensures that the individual never gets the quiet, unbroken space to realize they already possess the internal strength to survive the departure.